Hello. So we've got a lighting submission today, which is fabulous. So thank you very much to the artist for sharing. So today we have a lighting render that we're seeing here. We have a gray pass with the same lighting. So we'll be judging the lighting. And we have reference provided, which is perfect. That's amazing. With the lighting render, this is also full CG, obviously. So while I will not be speaking about build, the modeling, texturing, or shading, I will give notes about lighting as well as shot execution. So let's start with tech notes. We see here it's very sharp. And if we look in the background, it's quite blurry, and it's not actually reading as a defocus. It's reading as a resolution problem in our light rig, our HDRI, where it's visible to camera in Arnold and is creating a false impression of defocus that doesn't quite look correct. So it looks a bit like an error. So ideally, we would render, if we're using a real photo or background or HDRI lat long, behind the geometry, we'd render with an alpha, and then in a compositing step, replace background. To double check that, I did jump to Maya, and I will share that right now to make sure that my information was up to date. So I've just set up a scene where I've got a HDRI, I've got a sphere here in the front with a mirror shader, and I looked at the resolution parameter specifically in Arnold because I remembered that was there, to see if that was able to affect the fidelity of the HDRI to preserve what detail is there, or if it was in any way affecting the final result. So I'll just quickly show that I've got two lights, and I'm afraid to say, as I bring this up, as I switch between renders and we have a look at the reflection on the sphere, we are seeing a difference by using the full resolution in a secondary sense, in a reflection, but we are not seeing any further fidelity with that resolution change in the direct visibility of the light. Also, to make sure that the information is up to date, I checked filtering. So obviously these lights have a file texture parameter. And if we go to that, we've got filter options in terms of the default, I believe, is quadratic. I switched it to bitmap. In my testing, I tried multiple. And then in the Arnold section of the light, we've got bitmap bias to force it to fall to the higher resolution map within the TX file. And then obviously we've got filter options here. There is things do get worse. They can get pixelated if we change smart by cubic to closest or things like that. But there was no improvement or better fidelity than what is in the default settings. So we do land back on the notion that when we create a light, which I will do, I will select that light, camera visibility should be off still, and we should place, if there is a photographic background, we should place that either as a separate entity, not using the light visibility, but as a projection possibly, or as a compositing step. We should not be seeing the light as an element in the frame, fortunately, for fidelity reasons, as we've said. So that is our tech note. Let's look at the layout of the vegetation, the elements, the environment, by using scattering, I'm sure, and hand placement. So to do that, I'll say, first of all, this is very good. It's an underestimated task generally to place plants in a believable fashion because it's such an organic process that unless it's landscaped, it can very easily look artificial, look a little too hand placed. So I would say that this is quite successful. Let's jump to the reference, because what's working here, I think, could work a little better in terms of placement. And if I go to the reference, I think that will become clear. So in nature, obviously, we rarely see stepped scales. So we rarely see something that is smaller and then a bit bigger. And we rarely see large jumps in scales. So I'm generalizing. Of course, these things exist. You've got rocks standing on points that have been like that for thousands of years. It's insane. But nonetheless, in general, we tend to believe things if organically they sort of meander up scale-wise, right? And what's nice in this reference, which is I'm very glad was submitted, is we do see the sort of shorter grass getting longer. And as we look to the reference in the middle, shorter grass getting longer, and then larger vegetation next to larger vegetation next to larger. And so there's that sense that it's meandering upward in scale. It's getting bigger. It's very good. As we jump back to the submission, I do feel it's just a little bit too stepped in that this grass, I do see some variation here, a bit here in terms of length. But this grass in general feels as though it's a certain length, and then we've got some larger elements placed or scattered next to larger elements next to trees, which is correct placement and scattering. But I do feel that the transition from the short grass to those hand-placed elements could be smoothed a bit, either with further elements at different scales or with an increase in grass length as we get closer to that. And I believe that would feel more natural and more believable. We wouldn't question that as much. We really see it right here as well, where it just goes straight from flat to bush or foliage. So I think let's get a little bit of an increase in the grass scale and possibly some further elements to blend that transition into the trees. Another thing that I'll highlight, scatter and layout wise, is the fun of this, of the scatter, is it's really reverse engineering why something has happened. So I absolutely love doing this. And as we look at areas like this on our reference, there are obviously some relationships of tree to smaller plant, where the smaller plant benefits from the tree and therefore thrives. So you'll have certain kinds of brambles and plants that will like to grow next to the base of a tree, and so you'll get that transition upward, right? Then you have other relationships where, as I've circled here, the roots being exposed have made it to where there's not enough soil for the grass to grow, which means that there is actually a sort of bare patch. So communicating these different relationships to the different sizes of plant is not only very fun, but it's one of the things that makes we can see another area here where the foliage sort of stops as it approaches the tree. And then others, like as we see sort of here going up to these moments, everything seems to be thriving together. Telling that story of how the trees at the base are interacting with the surrounding foliage could be an interesting thing to explore. While the scales are working well, and we've talked about those notes, what is a question in my mind is, why are these plants here? And then why is there a long grassland plain behind with none of these plants? And so I would believe that these plants are here if it looks oasis-like. So I could believe that they are bunched up and gathered around a body of water here. So as we go to the reference again, this image is very successful creatively, because images that have diffuse and specular reflection in them. So you've got sort of fill light from all around, and you've got a mirror reflection on this mud. When you've got both of those in the frame, it describes the shape very well, and it's more visually interesting. So I think there's an opportunity, rather than following this, could we make a little bit of the ground wet? So, add a bit of wetness down here or over here, something to justify why this bunch of vegetation has sprung up and it didn't everywhere else, but also adding a bit more visual interest because it gives us a moment for some mirror or some more specular reflections. So those are the layout and scatter notes. Very, very strong piece, very good, pleasing to look at. And I do think that these things would just make it stronger. Let's talk about camera and composition. So at the moment, the feeling is it's very natural, relaxed in terms of the camera. It does feel as though we're out on this path. We've got our smartphone. We pull out our smartphone and we take a photo. However, what I'll say is there are a few things that can strengthen the composition, draw in the viewer, because taking a smartphone photo in a way is a way for us to remember what it was, but then we see it in its full dynamism. And then someone else, it's like why when we show our holiday photos, sometimes people are less interested in our holiday photos because they weren't there. So the photo is giving us the memory more than depicting the place. There are things we can do that communicate the place more and add dynamism. So first of all, the camera height feels very high. It feels about smartphone height, walking straight up, which is because it's a common view. It's how we see the world. It makes a beautiful setting feel common. So I would suggest let's drop that camera lower and then tilt up so that we don't have this horizon line right on the half. That tends to be, again, because that's how we see things, that tends to get filtered out as boring. So let's get the horizon off the halfway mark. Then I would say in terms of lens choice, one of the benefits of CG, one of the reasons I love it, is swapping a lens isn't stopping the shoot, right? It's moving a slider, and if we're using lens distortion, switching to a different lens distortion profile. So I think with this kind of thing, it would really benefit from a wider lens, so we can feel the trees sort of reaching over our heads. There's some great reference in a book called Framed Ink. The artist is just incredible at those low angle, wide lenses and making things feel incredibly dynamic, spanning away from you or reaching over you with those perspectives. So I recommend the book in general, and I think that some of those references could be really good for this as well. So I think lower camera, tilted, getting that horizon off the midpoint, wider lens, that makes everything a lot more dynamic. And then what we'll very often do in practical filmmaking is things tend to be more cinematic if you've got stacked depths. So if everything's sitting at one plane, at one depth from the camera, it doesn't feel very cinematic. It doesn't feel very dynamic. And it kind of gives the game away because it's a movie. We are watching a 2D screen. So if everything is sitting in 2D away from the camera, the movie feels flat, literally, which is not good. So one of the tricks to solve that is to put something in the super foreground, set dress something very close to camera down in a corner, right? Possibly put it out of focus. One of these leaves, one of these plants down here, just getting a couple of out of focus leaves down low, and super foreground gives us a few depth cues and a few, that gives us scale cues, and it makes for a more three-dimensional image, even though we're viewing it in 2 dimensions. So something super foreground, and again, that's exactly what is happening on film sets and in films of we're outside, we're out on the street, someone grab a street cone, put it right next to the camera. That's what the production design is doing, is introducing something closer that we can appreciate the depth stacking. So those are the camera and composition notes. Let's talk about lighting technically in terms of photo reality, and then let's talk about lighting creatively. So technically, lighting-wise, the dynamic range, the key to fill ratio, to me, and without reference that clashes with that, just based on my own, our own photos and things like that, it is not coming across as correct. It looks very filled in and very muted on the highlights. So if I go to this gray view, when you're shooting a photo with a DSLR and you bring it into Lightroom, especially if it's sort of outside, you've exposed for the sun, in which case you've driven all the fill into shadow, or you've exposed for the shadow, in which case you've blown out the sun. And then in Lightroom, you've got a highlight slider, you drag it down, you've got a shadow slider, you drag it up, and you get it to be something along the lines of what we're seeing here, dynamic range-wise. So a slightly more compressed look. But in reality, it's blown out, especially for how high the sun is. Obviously, if it's lower, it could be more of a sunrise sunset feel, lower angle, and therefore the ratio of key and fill might be a little closer. But for how high this light feels, I do not believe the ratio of key and fill. So if we are lighting with a HDRI, only with a HDRI, then I suspect that the HDRI has not had its range expanded properly. When we capture HDRIs, no matter how many brackets we shoot at the moment anyway, this is still the case, we're not capturing all of the brightness of the sun. So we need to shoot a gray ball, and the mirror ball, we need to expand the range to match the gray and mirror on a CG ball, so that then we've got the full dynamic range of that location, that setting. I suspect that this is a downloaded HDRI that did not come with grayball reference, which is always the danger with downloaded HDRIs, because then we're into the subjective. So I prefer and I recommend that people shoot their own HDRIs, even if they're shooting it with what they have to hand. But then if they've got any means of getting that gray card with a Macbeth, there are hacks you can do with the Macbeth to where you shoot it at multiple angles. So it's a sort of hacky gray ball. So, but then you're expanding the range in a known way. Lighting should not be subjective in terms of natural lighting. We should work. This is a capture and reproduce workflow. At the moment, we've gone into the subjective a little bit. I don't trust or believe the ratio of key to fill, technically. Now, creatively, what I'll say is there is a trend in cinematic lighting and architectural lighting and photography, for better or worse, that is back 3/4. So right now we've got the light sort of high and back. We've got a little bit of rim here. Obviously, if we go to our gray, we're seeing the same. A little bit of rim lighting, high, and behind the setting. So I would suggest creatively that we follow the trend, swing the light around a little bit to where it's getting a little bit more light on things from the side, and possibly elongating the shadows just a little bit, because the shadows coming right at us are just a little bit less interesting than they might be otherwise. So I think swing the light around and get a bit more light play on things back 3/4. The other thing is generally this very flat fill light is unflattering. It lacks shape. It feels, we're seeing these beautiful 3-dimensional things, and once again they look 2-dimensional, which means we're not communicating the shape the best way that we can. So what can help with that is negative fill. So a flag on set, this would be a flag, or something, a blocker to drive down the ambient light. So just a big black cloth hanging from a frame or something like that. but there definitely needs to be something driving down the fill side of these because it feels very lifted. So I think some negative fill behind camera, that could be a polygon, with a dark shader. Or it could be more of the dressed trees. So these same lovely trees that we're seeing here, if we've dressed more of them behind, then that could shadow believably the front side of this foliage. Right now, it feels as though it's completely empty behind camera, and it's just letting all this light in, which is kind of clashing with the sort of natural environment that I'm expecting. Thank you very much, and I would happily see this again if the artist wants to send in a revision. But otherwise, this is great, and I would love to see more. Thanks.